Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of AoS Close Ups. This week we will be examining Sigmar's Warrior Heralds, Scouts, and Vanguard, the Prosecutors. We will take a look at their background, the rules, and their roles on the tabletop. Prosecutors are the most common of Sigmar's warriors in the Angelos conclaves. These conclaves provide fast-striking aerial support and are separated into smaller units called retinues that are assigned to chambers within each storm host. Most Angelos retinues belong to the Harbinger chambers. These retinues form the vanguard of most attacks because of their speed and maneuverability. Prosecutors soar above the fray, summoning from the ether hammers or javelins at will, then hurl these conjured weapons at the advancing enemies, continuing to summon fresh weapons until the time is right to charge into the weakened force to finish off the remaining survivors. Prosecutors are also tasked to work in concert with the ground troops, harrying enemy battle lines and delaying enemy reinforcements. Once battle is joined, they swiftly strike at the enemy weak points or reinforce where needed. They are also entrusted to fly to the many corners of the world to locate allies in Sigmar's push to liberate the realms. Many a slave pit across the worlds have been freed thanks to the intervention of prosecutors. So let's go ahead and jump into the rules. So a minimum size unit of prosecutors needs to be at least 3 models. They are armed with celestial hammers, and they can either be armed with 2 of them, or a hammer and a shield, and then every 1 in 3 can be given a special weapon, the Grand Axe, the Grand Blade, or the Grand Hammer. The only upgrade for the prosecutors is the Prosecutor Prime, and that is the champion who gets 1 extra attack. From there we'll go ahead and look at the stats. They have an outstanding move of 12, they have a 4+ save, a bravery of 6, and 2 wounds. So right away, looking at these stats, you probably notice that these guys are essentially liberators that are both faster and hit better in combat, or wound better on combat, depending on what weapon option you take on a liberator. Having said that though, even though they're superior to liberators, I would say that you probably don't want to completely replace your liberators with prosecutors, and there's a couple reasons why. First, it's definitely based on their strong point, which is speed. If you're going to be bringing prosecutors, you're probably going to want to use that 12-inch move to your advantage, otherwise there's really no reason for you to bring them. And if you are using that speed, you're going to find that these prosecutors are going to start drifting out of your synergy bubbles, your command and spell abilities, whereas liberators are never going to be doing that because they're moving at the same speed as all your infantry characters and etc. So that is probably one reason if you don't want to just bring prosecutors. However, the other reason, which works in hand, you can't just look at these individually, is that if you are building armies, I'm going to assume that most people are going to be building their armies around the box sizes. So right away, I think on average, your prosecutors are going to be in smaller size units than your liberators. And this is taking into account that maybe any compacts you participate in are going to enforce that idea. So if that's the case, then resiliency is going to be really important there too, because they're just not going to have as many wounds as a unit, and so it will be really easy for your opponent to grind them down in the attrition battle. So these, of course, are not, if you really wanted to replace all your liberators with prosecutors, you'd probably be helping yourself out in as far as efficiency is concerned, but you're also not really using the speed at all to your advantage, since you are keeping all your prosecutors pretty much in a position that you would keep your liberators, which is centralized and moving at a slower pace because you're trying to stay within those bubbles. So that's just a couple thoughts on it. So looking at that, we'll go ahead and jump into the weapon options you can bring for the prosecutors with the celestial hammers. So the biggest thing with the prosecutors is they have a shooting attack. It's an 18-inch range attack that you can shoot 2 times, that hits and wounds on 4s and does 1 damage. If you bring the special ability where you can bring dual weapons, that means you can reroll your 1s both in shooting and in combat. And so when we go to combat, they are 1-inch range hammers that do 2 attacks again, and they hit and wound on 3s. And like I mentioned before, that's a little bit better than liberators. So here are some more strong points if you're thinking about just replacing all your liberators for prosecutors. Going into their special weapons, for every 1 in 3, you can take a Grand Axe, a Grand Blade, or a Grand Hammer. Now, the Grand Blade and the Grand Hammer are just mere reflections of each other. I think these are things you just pick on the aesthetic of what you prefer. And then the Grand Axe is a unique ability that generates the number of attacks equal to the number of models in range. Now, it's only a 1-inch range, and you're probably thinking immediately you may not be able to get too many attacks in. but since you are moving fairly fast, since they do have a 12-inch move range and they have an 18-inch charge attack, or up to 18 inches charge, you can get pretty deep into units. It just depends on the situation on the board. So you may be able to find yourself pretty surrounded by the enemy. Also, Prosecutor units tend to be 3 big, and if your opponent, for whatever reason, if you allow your opponent to consolidate first with their 3 inches, then they are going to be surrounding you, allowing you more attacks. Again, though, you are a smaller unit. You are not terribly resilient. You are more resilient than most other things, but you might find yourself attritioned out. So going over to the abilities, these are just things I've already mentioned before, but the abilities are Herald of Righteousness, giving you a 18-inch possible range because you get to roll 3d6. The dual weapons allow you to reroll 1s both in combat and shooting, and then the shield allows you to reroll 1s to your armor save. Next we have the other version of Prosecutors. Instead of it being armed with hammers, they're instead armed with javelins, and the special weapon here is a Storm Surge Trident. Whereas the previous models were more accurate in combat, it seems that these are more accurate in shooting, though they have less attacks. Their unit, a champion, gets 2 attacks rather than 1 in the shooting phase. As I mentioned earlier, this is the unit that has a more accurate shooting attack, though it is 1 less attack. It's 1 attack that hits on a 3 and wounds on a 3 and does 1 damage, and its special weapon does the same thing, except it has a rend characteristic and does 2 damage. In combat, they're worse than the other Prosecutors, both hitting and wounding on 4s, but everything else stays the same. Finally, looking at these special rules, they have the same special rules as the earlier Prosecutors, with both Heralds of Righteousness and the Sigmarite shields. However, what they do bring differently is with their javelins. If their javelins are over 9 inches away from the target they're shooting at, their damage characteristic changes from 1 to 2, making these fewer but more accurate shooting attacks count a bit more. So that's an overview of their rules. Now let's take it all together and see what they're good at on the table. So looking at the Prosecutors and talking about what their roles are on the tabletop, I'm going to focus on 2 of their biggest strengths, which is one, in my opinion, their speed, and the other is the accuracy of their attacks. And I want to differentiate their accuracy of attacks versus maybe powerful attacks and amount of attacks. Things like Blood Reavers have the strength of the amount of attacks. They can get up to about 5 attacks each, depending on what else you're synergizing with them, and it's just the weight of dice that are hoping will carry the day for you in those battles. Whereas things with powerful attacks may or may not have a lot of attacks, but their key strength is that they have high rend attacks that do lots of damage. Prosecutors fall in neither of these categories. They are, however, very accurate with their attacks, hitting and wounding on 3s. Depending on whether you're bringing the javelins, that means they're going to be accurate with their shooting attacks, or if you're talking about the ones with the hammers, then they're going to be more accurate with their close combat attacks. And so that's something you want to keep in mind as we talk about what their roles are going to be. And so their role, really, I think, in my opinion, is to kind of harass the enemy battle lines as they're advancing. Since they are fast, they can get ahead of your army and meet the army closer. I would stay in that max range area with their shooting attacks and kind of just pepper the enemies as they come forward. Now, you're not going to wipe out any of the units that are advancing, but you are probably going to be doing enough wounds where you may be tipping the balance in your later combats. When it comes to the units that are armed with the javelins, I would say you probably want to start targeting monsters and characters. You can probably start adding up the wounds on the monsters, maybe even knocking them down a level before combat joins. And I think that characters who are in the support roles are going to be extremely vulnerable to these type of attacks, since they're so accurate and they do 2 wounds each if you're staying in that max distance, which you should be anyways. With the Celestial Hammer-armed Prosecutors, their precision attacks lie in their close combat phase. They do have quite a few attacks that you can reroll 1s with their hammers if you're bringing them with the duels. But again, it's hitting and wounding on 4s, so you can't really think you're going to do too much damage with them. I would really pepper units over a couple rounds that you think you may be able to later join in combat with to finish them off. And that's really what these guys are for, I feel like. They target a weakened unit and prey upon them, wiping them out. They're also probably pretty good against targeting most enemies' wizards. Since wizards generally have a low armor save and only 5 wounds, I definitely think that a unit of 3 Prosecutors armed with either a grand hammer or a grand sword will make short work of that wizard. Whether you charge in with either version of the Prosecutors, do not be afraid to retreat in the next combat phase. If you see that you're going to get yourself into an attrition battle, or even if you just didn't finish off a unit in the turn you charge, don't be afraid just to retreat in your following phase, but always retreat in the opposite direction of where you want your enemy to go. So if you have an objective between your Prosecutors and your enemy, fly over your enemy's heads and make them make that decision. Are they going to try to go after your Prosecutors who are now behind their lines, or are they going to keep on going towards the objective while getting peppered by attacks? If they are charging and there is not objective, maybe you just retreat away from the other forces in your army. Make them have to make a decision on whether they want to again chase down your Prosecutors or continue towards your main lines. Now, more times than not, they'll probably make the wise decision and go towards the objective or your main lines. But if they don't, you've successfully started to break up their army cohesion. And if they do, you now have a unit behind their lines peppering them, and then have the freedom of movement to charge wherever they're needed. Simply, the role of the Prosecutor is to be annoying by targeting and threatening wizards, support characters, and small units to knocking off wounds of a monster. You're trying to make your opponent get so annoyed that they break up the cohesion of their force, and in doing so, you gain yourself an advantage on the tabletop. And that will conclude this episode of AoS Close Ups. Please like and subscribe. Feel free to comment below about what unit you'd like to see next, and thank you for watching.